Rabbi Moskowitz, thank you for joining us here with TribeHerald.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for agreeing to talk some pro-LGBT topics with us today, like we've been doing for these past few weeks, for those who care to subscribe. Something that's been going around Twitter today, #OnceGay. A group of people who consider themselves as being ex-gay. Now, these groups of ex-gay people come around periodically in the media, having said, you know, conversion therapy worked for me, prayer worked for me, X worked for me. Why can't you do it? And then, of course, you have people in religious communities who hold these people up, like, you see, he did it. Why can't you? How should we see these, you know, groups of people who call themselves ex-gay? Are they like deluded? Are they people who should be held up as paradigms? Like, what should how should people be seen when they call themselves, when they say things like, you know, God saved me from being gay? How should we take a statement like that?
Sure. I don't know that we should take those statements. You know, God doesn't save people from being straight or gay. God, you know, contributes, obviously, our soul, which reflects the essence of who we are. There's no prohibition in being attracted to people of the same gender, like there's no mitzvah in being attracted to people of the opposite gender. People need to be able to be true to who they are, to themselves, and also in relationship with another. To marry someone you're not attracted to is very much against Jewish law. To lie to a potential partner about your attractiveness to them is also problematic. So denying the existence of the queer experience is problematic because it denies reality. And whenever we deny reality, we end up in very horrific places. So there are people who have experimented along their journey of self-understanding and exploration to know who they are. That's part of life. We you know, try things to see if we like them or not, whether it's food or the type of, you know, books or news outlets. There's nothing wrong with a person trying to understand their own essence better. What I think becomes very problematic is, you know, because I, you know, used to eat meat and now I'm a vegan, that says nothing about anybody else. Even if that's true, even if a person says I've now developed a disgust for meat, okay, like shalom, that's fantastic. So I think in general, when we talk about conversion therapy, we need to acknowledge that it's traumatic. The experience for most people is traumatic. The experience for most people is that it's not successful. The experience for most people is that it converts them outside of Judaism, out of Judaism. Because why would you want to be a part of something that is trying to deny who you are? Judaism comes to acknowledge who we are and to create the best version of that. Now that can be straight, that can be queer, that can be bi. That's for the individual to determine based on who they are, what does God expect from them in the moment. But to deny who one is not helpful to anybody. In general, the people who have been the biggest and the loudest proponents of conversion therapy themselves have often been outed as queer, and the hatred and their homophobia just comes from a suppression of their own queer identity. So I would say in general, things that come out of conversion therapy are as false as the notion itself that a person's sexual orientation is something that can be reoriented, you know, from the outside. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. And if you ask anyone who's, you know, who's really honest, free from the hatred, people are, for the most part, where they are on a certain spectrum. And for some people, that is closer to being bisexual. For other people, that is kind of closer to the binaries of being straight or queer. But, you know, those are determined by a person and a partner, not, you know, some sort of organization with an agenda.
Now, another thing that's going around today, last night, the Labor Secretary, you don't want to get the name wrong, Eugene Scalia, just basically legalized workplace discrimination with federal contractors, using the religious freedom and using religious freedom as the justification that religious contractors shouldn't be forced to hire LGBTQ people if they have a strongly held, conscientious objection to it. Where does this, all right, first of all, where does this mitzvah of homophobia come from? Like, if you're this religious, like, why should, like, is this something that you should be pursuing? Should religious people want LGBT-free workplaces as something as to pursue as a religious agenda? And, how should Jews look at this whole, like, religious freedom thing as a permission to keep LGBT people out of our spaces?
Yeah, it's deeply upsetting, and there are certain organizations that spend a lot of time meeting with other religious traditions to try to form pacts and alliances. It's not dissimilar to the alliance around the Children's Victim Act, preventing survivors of sexual abuse from being able to sue the institutions that supported the child molesters. So I think in general, when the only interfaith work you're doing is around either protecting child molesters, or preventing justice, or in these bizarre kind of crossovers of wanting more power at the expense of those who don't have even basic access, it's always worth asking, is this about power, or is this about God? The idea recently that we've seen around religious freedoms and wearing masks, as if Judaism could ever position human health and well-being and the safety of others in opposition to religious practice. Religious practice is a function of making sure that people are taken care of. So I think that there's a way in which religion, and it's not new, has been hijacked, right, to suit the agendas of individuals having nothing to do with God. Homophobia is certainly one of those examples. God is not homophobic. If God is anything, there's a fear of heteronormativity, that even men and women can't be alone together, because all the straight people, you don't know what's going to happen with all the straight people if we leave them alone. So I think there's a sensitivity, I think in most places, that God and the tradition are often used to defend the person's worldview, but are not the source of the worldview. For example, racism is something that certainly exists within the Orthodox world. God isn't a racist. Xenophobia, or for the Hebrew Bible speaks about loving the stranger and about loving the convert, but we see unfortunately that doesn't play out. So once you see the way in which the word toeva, abomination, is used about people who are dishonest in business, but those people get parades and write books on ethics because they're straight, but the same word, so that it's really just a homophobia, and it's not so more specifically, people shouldn't be afraid to work with or to get to know people who are obviously LGBT, but even people who are different. Part of the power of insular communities is that it's easy to us and them, that we're good and everybody else is bad. And if you've never met anybody else, then you can believe that narrative. One of the biggest kind of tools around social justice is a function of proximity, that it's easy to hate somebody that you've never met or known. But once you get to know somebody and you happen to find out, it's one of the reasons why in the last 50 years there's been so much more progress around LGBT equality as opposed to racial justice, is because you can get to know somebody before you find out that they happen to be part of the queer community, where finding out the color of their skin often presents when you meet them. So those prejudices come and they are reinforced with this type of xenophobic or homophobic or transphobic ideology, when it has nothing to do with God. God says to love your neighbor. That doesn't mean your straight neighbor. That doesn't mean your white neighbor. That doesn't mean the one who voted for the people that you vote for. We have to love people as children of God, and God has made us all equally in God's image.
So in that respect, then it sounds like the responsibility is more on the employer here, to not even want to use religion as part of that agenda. Like, we want to have inclusive workplaces.
I mean, I think that society is diminished when we refuse to acknowledge the contributions that people in society can make, is particularly those who have been marginalized and objectified and forced out of mainstream society. And America, and even in the secular world here, has a lot of work to do to provide access and paths towards equality, and America is deficient because of it, because we haven't. But there was just legislation a few years ago in Massachusetts. They wanted to legalize discrimination against trans folks, denying access to public places like a hotel. You can't come here and rent a room if you're trans. The initiative was called Vote Yes on 3. It was the third initiative on the ballot, and voting yes would protect trans rights. So it passed by around 70-something% to protect trans rights in Massachusetts. But it's a very strange thing. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. I grew up in the South, and it's like not strange that people who have access want to make themselves feel better by denying access to other people. But that's not a Jewish concept. In fact, Judaism sees kind of the shift from discrimination and to equality as the shift of being enslaved to being liberated. In fact, yeah, that's very much the story of our people, the story of the Exodus of Egypt. And so, as always, there's a need and an obligation for allies to be able to be in that space from which kind of the fear and the hate is coming, to correct it, both for society but also for tradition, that our God is not a transphobic or homophobic God. And it's also the same around racism, and it's the same around, religious freedoms there's no religious freedom to infect somebody with a disease. Like there's no religious freedom to yourself get sick because of your own, lack of precaution. So there's a lot of reclaiming that needs to happen here.
So then in that respect, where does homophobia come from? Since homophobia doesn't make sense in the Torah. It's a sin in the sense that, it separates people and it makes, creates that us and them amongst the Jewish community. We don't see this with, Sabbath violators or people who, eat bread on Passover. Like, we don't see this with anything else. Like, do you think this comes from the secular community or?
Sure, it's a great question. Homophobia is not new, and people do feel threatened by it. People feel threatened that the institution of marriage is being threatened when it's offered to people of the same gender, and that's something it's so recent in this country that we have to appreciate how much progress over the last 50 years has happened. Where I work, CBST, when the world's largest LGBT synagogue, congregation based in Torah, when it first started, people asked, how can you have a gay synagogue? Because that was a time where nobody said it was okay just to be. And now people ask, why is it even necessary? Because for the most part, Jews in non-Orthodox spaces, for the most part, have found opportunities in leadership positions and basic equality. So it happens relatively quickly, but it's also very new. Marriage equality in this country is just a few years old. So just to articulate from those who do feel threatened, I think there's a long tradition of heteronormativity in the world and in Judaism. And I think for people who want, their children to follow in that path, then having other options is itself threatening. The problem with that is that if your child is queer, marrying somebody who's straight is bad for your child. It's bad for the partner. It's bad for community. And so when the world was a less safe world and there weren't options, people were closeted and people, found other ways of expressing themselves and finding love. But that was not a win. And now that the world has come to a place where they've come to really recognize that there's something called the queer experience, and that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, that there's the question now becomes, do we want to purge our communities of LGBT individuals or not? So if the answer is no, and I think that Judaism sees communities as being diverse and including people who believe in a certain kind of basic set of rules that has nothing to do with LGBT issues, and that I think everybody understands it better, that LGBT Jews should stay in mainstream communities. So then we have to start acknowledging their existence and their presence, and then ask new questions of what does that look like to be supportive of a tradition and the reality of the trans and queer experience.
Right. So now we're coming into Hanukkah this week. What should we be concentrating on? Hanukkah is a time of I mean, the word means inauguration. This is a time for, I mean, I was always told coming up that if you want to start something new, this is the time to do it spiritually.
Yeah.
Like, this is the time of inauguration. This is,
Yeah.
you know, brand newness and things like that. And this Hanukkah, specifically, you know, coming out of COVID and everything, you know, that idea of coming back into the sanctuaries with shuls and stuff reopening is literal this year.
Yeah.
What
Hopefully.
should we be thinking about this Hanukkah? You think, and what would your blessing for the community be for Klal Yisrael?
Yeah, it's a special time every year. It's a special time, and I think this year in particular, when we think about what does it mean to, like, you know, rededicate a space, there is a unique, I think, opportunity to revisit. You know, what does it mean to be accessible? What does it mean to be a sanctuary, literally a safe space for people to be in one's relationship with God? The candles remind us of what it means to just be with God. The Shla writes that the 36 candles that we light over the course of the 8 days correspond to the 36 hours with Adam and Eve in the garden before they were kicked out, 12 hours on Friday, 24 hours over Shabbos. And that's why there's a prohibition to use the candles for anything outside of just letting them be. We're supposed to just look at them, because the candles represent the soul of humanity, that Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that God's candle is our soul. And when we use a person or the divine light for something, for our own purpose, we objectify, we dehumanize, and that's where there's a prohibition. And so leaving the candles to just be reminds us of God's desire to be seen for who God is, that the light of the candles corresponds and has its source in the divine light in the beginning of creation, that God just wanted to be able to be in a relationship with us where God is able to be God's self. And so it's an opportunity to also remind ourselves, for those of us who are in positions of allyship, that the story of the Chashmonaim that who came and they searched for that candle, for that light, they weren't just doing it for themselves, they were doing it on behalf of the community, that there was just a few who really represented everybody. And so there's absolutely an aspect of kind of that accessibility of kol the ner like for each and every single person should be able to have their light in a way that allows for the expression. And so it's always a good time to remind ourselves of the question we should always ask, which is, you know, what do I want my candle to be? Where in the darkness do I want to stand and be a light? So I hope as a blessing for the community that people should be able to find the agency and the platform and recognize their unique contribution to the world, to be able to allow their one and unique candle to shine bright, to be the light, and to inspire others who perhaps are in places of darkness to know that they're not alone and that the light is real and we are that light.
Amen, God willing. And thank you so much for joining us this week. And as a reminder to everyone watching, we have Pro-LGBTQ Torah from an Orthodox perspective every week coming up from TribeHerald. Thank you again for joining us this week, and I will see you again soon.